Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Sfarim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Michelle Margolis, who is the Norman E. Alexander Librarian for Jewish Studies at Columbia University. And this is the first episode of a new mini-series here on the podcast, The History of the Early Printed Hebrew Book, which is a long time coming. This episode and the other episodes in this series are sponsored by Sefaria. If you've ever wanted instant access to Torah, Talmud, and hundreds of other Sfarim, all at your fingertips, fully searchable and cross-referenced, Sefaria is for you. Sefaria is a free digital library of Jewish texts in Hebrew and in translation. Whether you're learning Daf Yomi, preparing a shir, or just looking to explore something new, Sefaria makes it easy to find sources and dive deeper. You find Rishonim and Achronim, Sifrei Halacha, Mefarshim, Chasidus, and more, all on your phone, tablet, or computer. And everything is completely free. Visit www.sefaria.org. That's SEFARIA.org to start learning today. And I want to say that this is Sfarim Chatter, so we really should have done an episode or a series on Sfarim before this. And I've been asked over the years, and it just never came to be. And a few months ago, I got an email from Sarah Wolkenfeld at Sefaria, and she brought up this idea and that Sefaria would potentially be interested in sponsoring. And so I'm glad that they have, and they've, really helped this happen finally. And so I think we're long overdue for a history of the printed book. And we're going to start with the early printed book. And so we'll leave ourselves room in the future to discuss manuscripts, which we're not really going to discuss here, things that are prior to print. And then later on print, which we'll touch on a little bit, but that's not going to be the focus of this series. Additionally, as we start this series, I think it's important, and this is a little hard because we're doing this audio and not video, but it's important to explain print. Now, I'm asked this all the time, Michelle, I'm sure you're asked this all the time, is what is print? How do things come to be printed? And it's so important, even today, when we have Microsoft Word and Notes and Google Docs and printing is laser printed. We're going to explain what all these things mean. But when it started off, movable type, what a printing press was like, what a printing house was like, these are things that are so important. And they're still important to us today, even in the digital age with Sefaria and other digital online programs. It's so important for us. And just one example, as we'll get to, just right here at the beginning, where we have the Gemara, and we always talk about the Tfus Rishon, and usually, even though we'll talk about Sensino, we're really referring to like Bamberg, and referring to like the first print and how important it was. But like, what was that printing house like? And Bamberg wasn't Jewish, and who worked at that press, and how did they set up the Tzuras Hadaf? And the same for other things as we get to. So, and it's important, we'll get up to the Rum press, which is the Vilna Shas that everyone's familiar with. So, there's a lot here that's very, very important. So again, we're going to do some general overview in the beginning, some general discussion about books, and then we'll get to the Hebrew book. So with that, thank you, Michelle, for joining me once again.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Let's jump right in. And let's orient the listener. Where are we in time? This is about middle of the 15th century, so the 1400s. We're in Europe, generally in Germany. Of course, we're going to talk about Gutenberg to some extent here, and yes or no. But let's explain very, very briefly, because we're not really talking about manuscripts, like what was going on before, and then what happens with the printing press, the invention of the printing press or movable type.
Yeah, so the concept of using pre-prepared images that were inked and put onto a paper existed before Gutenberg. So what we know, what I call woodcuts or carved images that would then be inked and stamped on multiple pages, was something that existed. Actually, in the Cairo Geniza, there's a print that has been dated to a lot of different periods, but late 14th, early 15th century. It has red, it has black. It's a beautiful piece. But that's not movable type. Movable type is when you have the individual letters that are laid out onto a frame individually, packed in very carefully, and then put into a press, which is this big machine that they actually would put the paper onto, and then it was sort of like a screw. You would turn a handle, then ink the paper, and you could do that over and over. The innovation here was that you could then take the piece apart. You could take all those letters out and make new words with the same letter. So it was much less work than having to carve out the entire page that you wanted printed. So that was the innovation that they said Gutenberg did. Now, there's a really interesting story from 1444 in Avignon where we only know about it because there was a lawsuit that was brought that is attested to in the archives, where an engraver was hired by a Jew to carve what is interpreted by scholars to be letters. And so there is some possibility that there were attempts at making movable type prior to Gutenberg, but we have no evidence of any books that were made. We don't have any proof of that until really Gutenberg produced his first prints in the 1450s.
Okay, and he's in Mainz in Germany. Yeah. So we're explaining a little bit more what a printing press. You kind of those primitive machines. Maybe people are familiar with like old Matsu machines or something. Like there's like a machine where you, like you said, you're hand cranking, you're turning it. So what is the press? You already explained what movable type is, and they would rearrange the letters. So someone would have to cut those letters, if you will,
yes.
create, and then you have different fonts, so to speak, and then you would then go and arrange them in a page and print. Like, what was the process like printing a book?
It's hard to explain without the picture, but I'll do my best. So even the way the letters were created were actually with matrices. So they were these forms that were created that one could then pour lead into to create the type. So you had sort of a master that was a backwards letter, and you could create multiple pieces of type based once you had the matrix. And then you created many, many letters, because if you think about a single page, you have many L's or lameds on the same page. So you need many, many actual letters, many copies of the individual letters. And then, so that's even just to make the page. And if you think about how the page looks, there are blank spaces. So they had what's called furniture, where they put these pieces in to hold everything together. It needed to be very solid in order so that it wouldn't fall apart when you put it in the press. And then the press itself actually was built based on a wine press. And so you have to think about it. If you can think of what those images of a press look like, you can't think of, there's actually a screw at the top that would pull it tight. So you would pull this handle on the screw, and once everything was set into place, it would sort of pull it really tight so that the ink would be adhered to the paper really tightly. And then you pull it out and you hang it to dry, and you go and you do it again over and over and over and over. And what's really amazing about it is that while the actual press itself is very big and very heavy, it's made out of wood, it's very easy to replicate. And we'll talk about this a little bit with once we get to the Spanish printers and the movement of different printers. All you really needed were the types. And once you had the types, you could easily, it took 2-3 days to hire a carpenter to rebuild the big press. But it was a relatively mobile craft, which is really important for Jews, especially in the 15th century. There's a lot of movement of Jews, whether they liked it or not, during this period.
So that's definitely important that it was able to be moved and it wasn't just in one place. And that's something that's going to come up, especially as we get to episode 2 with Soncino or Shancino, and we're going to we'll discuss more about that family. But okay, so a little bit more. So as you mentioned, the press originates, and again, it's in popular culture. It's Gutenberg is the creator, again, of movable type, whatever, although we know it existed in Asia and much beforehand.
Yeah, as early as the 13th century, it's documented in Eastern, in Asia.
Correct. So we know definitely before. Okay, so manuscript, listeners are probably familiar, are, Xaviad, they're drawn out by hand. They're illuminated, whatever, etc. So that's what was going on. And we've mentioned on the podcast in the past, manuscripts continue to be used. There's this manuscript culture that continues even after print. But generally, print comes along, and print now dispossesses that. And now we're printing books and mass-produced, so to speak, quote unquote, even to some extent, versus a copyist copying by hand a full book, a full Gemara every time, rather we can just print it.
What you see is that, my focus is, of course, going to be on the Hebrew printing, but even the printers themselves were just completely overwhelmed by how amazing this process was. One writes how previously one had to pull together 4 different manuscripts in order to study Torah, for instance. You needed the Torah text, and then you needed one Rashi, and then you needed another commentary, and you had them all in different manuscripts. Whereas here, you could put it all together in one. And they're so overwhelmed with it. They talk about writing with many pens at one time. They talk about it as a nace. It's over and over. You see just the way the printers describe it as something that's just incredible.
And it's also, I don't think we can underscore enough how important this is. There's actually a new book on Johannes Gutenberg, a biography and books by Eric Marshall White, also a librarian in Princeton, and perhaps there'll be a podcast on him, even though it's not a Jewish thing. And he says in the beginning of the book, which struck me, that in the year 2000, many media outlets celebrated Gutenberg as the man of the millennium. He said, whether or not that's the point, the point is, and then people put together so many more candidates with life-saving, peacekeeping, humanitarian, rights-defending accomplishment, whatever you want to say. Like this guy, Gutenberg, and again, whether he created it or not, the point is how important, just can't be underscored how important he really is, that how important print was, and that now we have digital, but how important this technology was.
And we can say Gutenberg. I mean, Gutenberg is the representation of this new technology.
Correct.
So we can...
But when we say his name, we mean him. So print is just so extremely important. Okay, so we have these manuscripts, and now we transition to print. As we explained already, you kind of explained what movable type is, what a press is. And again, I don't want to spend a long time on it, but there's a couple of things that we have to because it's going to come up, especially as we get to Hebrew books. So what was the process like? So you explained what a press is, but when we talk, let's talk about the printing press as globally, not specifically the actual machine, but the shop, the printer's shop. So there's a printer, and then there's like an acquisition editor, and then there's
not an acquisition,
but there's essentially there's an editor, and then there's someone that's setting the type. So what are the different people? What are they doing? How are they like what's going on? How many things? It's just simple things like how many pages are they printing a day because they have to set up the type and then reassemble into a different page. So what's the day? What is a day in the life of a print shop in the 15th century?
So we see a lot of things. Again, most of what we have is based on what's written in these colophons. A colophon is sort of like an old-fashioned title page. They used to write all the important people that needed to be thanked for doing the work. They write the date it was published. All that. It's based on manuscript. And the first 50 or so years of printing, they would put all that information at the very end of the book instead of at the beginning in a title page. This was before there were title pages. And they would thank various people. This is I, so-and-so, am the printer. I am the typesetter. I am the editor. And if you think about it, when you're putting in all of these pieces of type into a frame and it needs to be printed, somebody actually had to read the first print of every single page because inevitably there are going to be edits. The people who are putting the type in are not always educated, often because you needed small fingers to be able to manipulate the type. You had women or children who were setting the actual type and they were just copying based on a printer's proof. Or some manuscript that they were trying to copy from. So they would make mistakes. So somebody who actually knew the text then had to read it once it was printed to make sure everything was put in right, to make sure that no letter was put in upside down. I mean, there were many, many possibilities of how things can go wrong. You have something that in Hebrew is called, you see the term mevi ladfus, and that's sort of like the backer, the financial backer, the person who's paying for the printing. And they're often thanked, of course, in the colophons. The printer himself is usually the person who owns the shop. So he's the person who made the investment and is running this actual print shop. I think I'm trying to remember if I'm missing anything.
I think that's good. And we're going to circle back throughout the series to different people, different come up, especially as we get to Bomberg and we get to
you also have to remember
other people.
Once the paper comes off the press, depending on, should we wait to get into sizes? We can talk about sizes here.
No, I think we should talk about it here. I hope we're not boring the listener at the beginning, but I just want to, it's so important. People have probably seen the term a folio, quarto, octavo. They're like, what are these? What's going on? What is that? Like, what are these terms?
Yeah. So essentially the paper that they used was pretty large. It was kind of the size that you would think like a poster paper today. And one poster was then folded in half to make what's called a folio. So those are the largest books. And the largest books are actually, some of the early incunabula, the books that are printed in the first 50 or so years of printing, they can be quite large. They can be almost 2 feet high. Really very big books. So those were just pages that were folded in half, which meant that there were actually 2 pages on each on the press. So they would lay the paper down on 2 inked frames, and then when they would take it off, they would then they would actually turn it over and print the other side, 2 pages, and then they would fold it. And they would take all of these folded sets and they would put them one after another, and then they would sew them and bind them together. For something, a quarto, so quarto is from 4, that's where you had actually 4 pages at the same time, and you would fold it twice. So you would make 4 pages. So you had to think what you're printing is actually not page 1 is not next to page 2 necessarily. The way that the quarto is folded has to do with how it will look like when it's folded rather than sequential. So you have all these sort of calculations. And in fact, in early printed books, you don't have page numbers, you have signature marks. So you have at the bottom of on a Hebrew book, on the left-hand side of the page, you have a Hebrew letter or a number. And that's telling you that this is leaf 1. They often didn't have the first, but 2, 3, and 4. And then 5, 6, 7, 8. So you know that it's in the right order. And you can say, this is set number 1 of this book. And they would put set number 1 in, and then number 2, and then number 3, and then they could bind it all together.
About binding, also, were all the books bound at the shop? Or they were bound, or they sold them in like bundles of paper, and then you had to bind it? How did that happen?
So probably the latter. Again, it's hard to say. That the booksellers didn't tell us exactly what they were doing. The bookmakers didn't tell us exactly what they were doing. But the print shop, you think you can go into a bookstore today and you pull these ready-made books off the shelves. You would go into a print shop and you would buy a pile of papers, essentially. They were all folded together, and then you could go next door maybe to the binder. There's a wonderful book called The Bookseller of Venice, which goes through how a person would encounter books in the 15th century. And it talks about how there was this one street in Venice where Florence, not Venice. There was this street in Florence, which was the street of the booksellers. And you would go from the printer to the binder and you would get all the pieces of what you needed in order to make your books. Books are still very expensive at this point. Certainly by the 16th century, so it's probably even more expensive now. Studies have shown that a book was worth the average yearly salary of a day laborer. So this is like buying a car, is buying a book. Still, it's only for rich people, but it's like upper middle class can buy them now too.
Yeah, and you've seen that. You see that it comes up even in Sfarim. I think I did a podcast a little while back on, there was a reprint of a sefer, I think from Corfu, and I think that's the one who wrote a sefer on Musaf, and I think he says he was lost, and like his farm got lost, and he's saying like Echa, like Leila Ani Boichia on his books that he lost, and it was like obviously not only using farm, it was a big deal. You lost a lot of things, so that's something of that. It's important you mentioned.
Books were inherited. Books were more than just the text themselves. They were actually property. It was really important. You see disputes in inheritance disputes, and
this is something that you're involved with as well, about tracing books and where they went, and we're going to get into that later. So, okay, I think this is a lot of things that we've discussed, how books worked, and we are going to turn to Hebrew books. I do want to mention a very interesting quote that I saw. So, first of all, we should mention right here in the beginning, and we're going to mention throughout at the end of the episode and throughout the series suggested reading, but one of the classic books, it's a little outdated, but it's still a wonderful book, is The Makers of Hebrew Books in Italy by David Amram. It's about 1909 or
1909.
So,
so it's over 100 years old.
It's dated, but it's still a wonderful book. It's really a wonderful read. And so he quotes from Port Leon, who is the Shilta Gibarim, which is a very interesting sefer, to say the least, and it was redone by Machon Yerushalayim. And he's talking about, it's all about things in the Beis HaMikdash. So he's talking about, printing and different things. And he in middle, he goes on a rant about print, and he says, I can't hold back from talking about the Chacham of this generation. They believe they think that print is a new thing. It never was. It was only 100 years old. And we just explained, by the way, that in Kanabala is the first century of print, so until 1500. He's a little later. He says, he's around 1600, I think. They don't know, they don't know and understand. It was known to us, hundreds from thousands, hundreds and thousands of years. All the way back to the beginning of creation. Either way, much before this. And he says, what's his proof? He says, he quotes Eev, Job, and he goes on a whole thing quoting Medrash when Eev lived. Okay, I think this is, everyone knows the Medrash, and Eev is one of the Yotzim of Pari. And he continues, and he says, if you look in Eev, and this is a pasuk that comes up again and again when it relates to print. In Eev, this is in pasuk in Perek Yotes, pasuk of Gimel, of Dalet. Eev says, the pasuk in Eev, just to quote it, Eev is complaining. He says, Mi yitin efoi vichte von miloi, mi yitin basefer v'yachuku, be'et barzel v'ifores lo'ad batsur yechtzovun. So basically, essentially, Eev is saying, If only my words were written, then engraved in bronze with a stylus of iron and lead, carved in stone for eternity. So it's engraved and carved. It's a known
Certainly
quote.
we know about stone carving.
Right. So this is the pasuk in Eiv. So the Shulta Gebarim continues, and he says, Eiv obviously knew what was going on. If you see in Eiv, he says, "Mi yitin evav yechavin miloi sheyaksiva anasas pershimas hadyoi mi yitin besefer v'yechuku v'yaksiva chakuko v'amalea gam yochar anas malechas atfus b'New York asher marnato." It's print, and he had just finished explaining how you print and how you set the type and how you push it in. You can read the whole description in Shulta Gebarim. In the new edition, in the old, it's Kuf Pei Gimel Beis in the old one, and the new one, it's Tough Ratio Test. You can read Machon Shleim if those interested in reading it inside and actually reading what he's saying. My point is not to say that print existed for hundreds or thousands of years, whether yes or not, that you can read the Shulchan Aruch inside, but obviously he was, saying that we knew about this, print existed, etc.
Forms of creation of text. There are some studies that have been done of the book in Jewish history. There are a couple of books that were written on the book based on Torah. Like, what does it mean to write something on a scroll when it says in Esther, when it says that something's written? We translate it as scroll. What did they use? We don't know.
But one thing to say in defense of Avram Port-Leon, Avram Misharaye, is that when he wrote this, the accepted thing was that Gutenberg created the press. And that's been proven wrong. Yeah. And we know it predates definitely to Asia before. So that's one thing to say about this. Hundreds of years before, he says, well, hundreds of years. That's definitely true. So regardless, that's a very interesting Hebrew source who says, oh, no, we, in Newer print. And he was thinking and engaging with print. Now, let's turn to Hebrew print. The beginnings, the genesis of Hebrew print, Gutenberg was not Jewish, even though we have a famous Gutenberg Bible, but
and in fact, Jews were not allowed to print in Germany, in the German lands at that time. They weren't allowed to join the guilds, and there were other reasons. But there was printing in Hebrew in Germany in the 15th century, but not with movable type. It was all woodcut, and usually in anti-Jewish books, they were quoting Jewish texts that were ostensibly against Christianity. So there are a few German imprints that were that used Hebrew, but they weren't with movable type.
Hebrew presses, let's talk about Hebrew printing. And the first Hebrew press, the first Hebrew printers, again, what we know of it, obviously things from this time, there are things that are murky, lost to time. Yes. We don't know, things that are not around. But what do we know of the first Hebrew print and the first Hebrew Sfarim? So
it seems that the first printers of Hebrew were working in Rome. They actually were trained by students, not really students, but people who came after Gutenberg. They were trained by Gutenberg. Schweinheim and Panartz, who were two German printers who ended up in Rome. And they printed, these two printers printed in Rome. And then there are these books that turn up that are not dated, but based on various things, the paper, the kinds of paper, the watermarks, the style of printing, even the fact that it's printed in two columns in a very specific kind of way with a certain amount of lines per column. Scholars have determined that these books were printed in Rome probably between 1469 and 1471. And then there's another set that's printed in Rome between prior to 1475. So that's really when you have the very first books that are printed. They're printed in Rome by a couple of brothers. And they're sort of I always say when I'm teaching students about the origins of print, I say, and what would you expect if you were a Jewish printer? What would be the first thing that you would want to print? And if they think for a second, they don't say the Torah, because the Torah is something that's available. The Torah is something that you have in the shul. You can access the whole Tanakh, because if you actually have the Nevi'im and Ksuvim on cloth at that time. You're reading it from a cloth. So you have access to the actual text of the Torah. What you don't have is commentary. What you don't have is halacha. What you don't have is Gemara. So that's immediately what's printed. The first books that are printed are Rambam's Mishnah Torah, are Rashi. There are many editions of Rashi are printed in the 15th century. You have the Torah. The Torah is printed again in multiple editions. Interestingly, Sefer HaSharashim, which is a Hebrew grammar, is printed, but that's also of interest to Christians. So that's something that can work on both sides. Radak, sorry. And of course, Radak's commentaries as well, because you want to be able to learn Torah. So you have immediately, you can see what's of interest and what's a need to the Jewish communities, because again, it's not a small thing to print. It's still easier than producing a single manuscript, which can take a very long time, and you only have one when you're done. Whereas you can print maybe 300 books, and it'll take you 300 copies of a single book over the course of a year. But you have to expect that you're going to be able to sell those books. It's a huge investment. So looking at actually what they printed is really interesting as well. We could talk about that a little bit more later too.
Yeah, that'll be important, because to see what they printed, you can go back and look at like what were they interested in, what were they publishing. I also want to read another quote from Amram, because I didn't read his quote before, but I thought this was a really wonderful quote talking about the importance of Hebrew print. And he says, I'll quote, he also has a wonderful Old English. It's really a pleasure to read.
His language is really lovely. I will say, if you read Amram, he talks a lot about work that hasn't been done, and in the 100 or so years since he printed it, there's been an incredible amount of scholarship. Also some scholarship that has proven him wrong.
Yes.
So read it sort of with a grain of salt, with a half a grain of salt, because there's a lot more research that's been done since.
100%, and that applies to when you're reading old history.
In general, yeah.
However, it's still like, he still has a comprehensive book like on the subject, and it's a wonderful read. I found it to be a pleasurable read.
Yeah.
And people are probably listening going, that's boring. No, it's actually not. He's really good. So he says like this: the history of Hebrew typography is an important auxiliary to the study of Jewish history, for it reflects the degree of culture, the scope of interest, and the physical and intellectual activities of the people. The mere outward form of the book will often give significant hints to the student. In the books issued by the early Italian Hebrew presses, the quality of the paper, the shining lustre of the ink, the artistic form of the letters, the broad spacing and margins reflect a life of comparative ease and security in the most cultured of all modern lands. In the later books, we may read the vicissitudes of life, in the gradual degeneration of the art of Hebrew printing, as well as in the change in the character of the works produced, for trials and tribulations soon cut a people off from the need and enjoyment of the higher and more varied forms of literature, and throw them back to the prayer book where their sorrows may find expression and consolation. And then, he goes on and he talks about the Pope and things like that. Again, whether or not everything, things have changed, history's proven out, different things different. But I also, it's connected to what you were just saying, in that you see what they were printing in the first century of print. It's like interesting to see. So you're like Radak and Rashi and Chuvas Rashba and Ramban, Pirush Ramban Al Torah is printed multiple times. But then you get things like we're going to get to Neufes Sufim of Yehuda Massiliona is printing his book, and you have books such as, I think you have Evan Beichen,
the Machbarot Emmanuel,
Machbarot Emmanuel, right? That's what the Shulchan Aruch is writing. Oh, you can't read that. Like you see, they're printing like satire and they're printing like literature. And you see, I don't remember offhand, like when Mishlei Shulim and these type of the fables and those type of works. They're a little later, but like you see works. I mean, obviously a lot of Chumash commentaries. We mentioned Ralbag is printed many times. There's an
edition of Avicenna's Canon, translated Canon of Medicine. This is the medical textbook printed in 1492 in Naples in Hebrew. It's a massive volume. It's I don't know, 5 inches thick in one volume, which is what we have at Columbia. And it's incredible. And the copy that we have is annotated in both Latin and in Hebrew. And I don't know if it's the same person who's doing this writing, but you have doctors, Italian doctors. Jews were allowed to go to the medical school at Padua and become doctors. And so having a copy of Avicenna's Canon was critical in Hebrew was critical for the work that they were doing. So you have even non-Jewish books that are being printed specifically for Jews. It was also being printed in Latin for Latin doctors. But this was important enough to invest a lot of money in printing this, because there was clearly a demand for it.
Yeah, and you have, I just went to pull off the shelf, you have Mishlei with Emmanuel of Rome that was printed in Naples as well. Yeah. So Emmanuel's commentary on Mishlei, which I've talked about, the Chidah says that's the commentary on Mishlei you should read. Yeah. So,
notwithstanding his other book being banned or not being appropriate to read on Shabbos.
Correct. No, actually, the Shulchan Aruch is talking about not appropriate to read on Shabbos, and he says banned. You can't read it.
Oh, he does say it's banned.
Correct. Okay. Even though he's doing things to read on Shabbos. Correct. Yeah. But the Chidah and Shem says, but Mishlei is the one you want to be reading, Emmanuel.
This is his commentary.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. So, but that's printed in Naples. And so, you can see, it's very interesting to see what they were printing. Although, again, as you said, generally it's what you would assume. They're printing things that are important for, Mefarshim and things on Avalacha and things like that. So, again, you mentioned in Rome. So, when we turn to Rome, like, what were those books like? Again, people probably imagine when they do think of old books, perhaps they do, I shouldn't say maybe, where they have these elaborate title pages. Sometimes they have, designs and pictures. There were no title pages.
Nothing.
So explain
Nothing.
in the
You don't
incunabula
even
period.
have literally the first page that is the beginning of the text. If there's anything at the beginning, like not quite an index, but I'm thinking of the Mishnah Torah, for example, which is part of the second set that was printed. You have sort of a list of all of the sections of the Mishnah Torah, or the Truvas Rashba, for instance. So it goes into all of the sections of what the Truvas are. There's sort of a thing at the beginning that's telling you what you're going to look at. But it just starts. There's no such thing as a title page. It just starts the book. Amar HaMechaber. It just goes right into the text. They're just getting started. So this is something that has come up.
So how many books were printed in Rome? Do we know anything about this press? Like who set the press? Like how do we know, like in the beginning, and we're going to talk about again, all the incunables, we'll head over to Spain and Portugal, so important before the expulsion. But Rome in the beginning here, we mentioned what's happened? Who does this press? Do we know anything about it?
We just know the names of the printers. Ovadia, Menashe, and Benjamin of Rome. Or Benjamin of Rome. They're mentioned in just one or two of those printed works, but we know that it's the exact same typeface. There's been a lot of studies done on the actual fonts that were used, and you can identify a book as being part of a particular press because the fonts were actually very different. You have to think about they're making choices at this point. We look at a modern Hebrew book that's printed, and you expect a certain kind of square typeface that is maybe similar to Ksavashuri. Then you have a semi-cursive typeface that's based on the semi-cursive Spanish handwriting, which we call Rashi script because it's what the commentaries were printed in. Of course, and I have to say this every time I mention it, is that Rashi would not have been able to read Rashi script because that's the script that they used in Spain, but it was used to differentiate from the Torah text and to say this is a commentary, this is something else, so that you can make that distinction. But scholars have identified all the different kinds of typefaces from this period because they're really very different. They're making them brand new. And you could say, oh, this is very clearly the Roman typeface. And so we know of something like 8 or 9 books that were printed in Rome based on the typeface that was used.
Yeah, and that's an important part. I was going to get to the Rashi script thing, and that's something, it's like a misconception. Like Rashi exactly was based in Spain. That's how they printed to differentiate. I mean, think of today when you have different fonts or even, italics or bold or everything. It's something to differentiate from the text. Use a script that came to be known as Rashi script based on the Spanish. So it was a small press in Rome, essentially, printing a few books, not many.
But you have to remember that we have something like 150 or so, maybe a little more, maybe a little less, books that we know that were printed before 1501 in Hebrew. It could be that there were more. It's likely that there were more. The story of the Jewish book is that it's destroyed, it's discarded, it's sort of used to death. And so it's possible that there were more books that were printed by this press, but it's also possible that this was it. Again, remember, it's a major investment of both time and money. So it takes a very long time to print. So if this group of printers from Rome printed 8 books, it would have been over the course of, say, 8 years. Then maybe they moved on. Maybe something happened in Rome and they had to stop. There are different reasons that presses would have stopped.
Right. I think we explained that before because basically, I think you explained this, that if you printed one page, I set up the type for one page and they were inking the pages, they were doing like 250 pages a day or something. So it was going to take them like a year to print the book, essentially.
Yeah, roughly.
And they'd have to reset the type and reprint without any off days, and a press is not working on Shabbos or Yom Tov. So this is taking time to publish these books. This wasn't like a quick thing. I mean, even today, for those that are familiar with presses, it does take time anyways. Not the actual printing, but like putting together a book and editing it.
It's the layout and the editing. And
correct. We do it like on the back end before we laser print things today.
Right.
But so this took time. This wasn't like a press play and then it just like printed. And so that's something that's very interesting as well. But like you said, there really was very little in the title page. They're very just like printed.
There was no title page.
There was nothing. There was nothing. Right in the colophon.
You might bind in a blank sheet of paper before your text starts, but that's a choice of the owner and the binder.
I also want to say, when we're talking about these old books, if anyone is familiar with incunabula or books as we get into like post incunabula, like in the beginning of the 16th century, and we'll get up to Venice and Bamberg and Chiancino as well. These books are beautiful. Wide margins.
They really are.
If you see them in person, beautiful paper, which we'll discuss paper, but they're really beautiful. The text is beautiful. And I said this in one of the auction chatters recently, how, people say, oh, old print, it's disgusting. That's because they're used to European presses that come later.
19th century with acidic paper.
Acidic paper. and or they grew up with like these like photo offset, which is like photocopied and photocopied and photocopied, and they're just like awful. When you go back to the original, you can if you show someone an original from Italy, they're like, wow, that is amazing.
Gorgeous.
That's like clearer than a print today. Like, how do you guys? It's a beautiful, beautiful text.
You can see the impression of the type on the page. I mean, you see where the page is pushed in a little bit because there was metal that pushed into it, and the paper itself is very high quality. It's made from fabric that's been put through some certain matter, certain liquids to make it come apart. And it's really it's good quality. If you feel the paper, it's very soft.
Drag paper, but they also printed on vellum, right? Gutenberg was printing
there was
on vellum?
some printing on vellum, yeah. So that was luxury. That's actually parchment. They would print on parchment, not
animal skin.
Animal skin, yeah. So cloth. I mean, they're printing on it's parchment rather than yeah. And you see it's just beautiful. I mean, what can I say? Try and find yourself an incunable just so that you can look at it.
Yeah, go to library or collection or come up at auction now all the time. These incunabulas still come up. So yeah. I was recently at an event where they had a incunabule from like 1497 or I'm buying from like Lisbon, and it was so cool. It was missing pages, but it was so cool to look at. And people were like looking at like the Slavita Shas. I'm like, no. This is so much more interesting. What do this is when this came from Portugal from before the expulsion. Okay, let's turn to it. I mean, there's Mantua, and Bologna, Naples, then Portugal. I mean, we can get to Mantua because Neufes Sufim is so important. Yehuda Master Leon. This is the first book, I think, printed in the lifetime of the author in 1475. Yeah. If I'm not mistaken, I think it's the first one.
I believe so.
He's in 1475. So Neufes Sufim is printed in Mantua this is 1475. Yehuda Master Leon. He's famous for, there's a controversy with the Marik, Rabbi Yosef Cologne Traboto. I talked about that on the podcast with Professor Wolf, Jeffrey Wolf, a while ago. So there's also no title page there. It just starts. So if he actually has a little small like letter, I guess it's like almost like an intro, like at the top of the page where he says,
sometimes they'll have like a decorative word at the top.
No, but then he has a few words. He says, Adar Chafetz Sifsei Das, O generation desiring the lips of knowledge. I'm reading there, by the way, there's an Hebrew-English translation of Neufes Sufim done a couple of decades ago.
Yeah.
He says, Alman nirpim atem nirpim, wherefore are ye idle, Hetivu nagin harbu shir, make sweet melodies, sing many songs, ki ba magid Neufes Sufim, for a propounder of the honeycomb's flow. Chaber Sefer Imre Shefer, he has composed a book, Goodly Words, Kishmoy Kinhu Neufes Sufim, which is even as its name, the honeycomb's flow. And then he says, Amar ha'eved ha'katan ha'ohov ha'oyev ha'neman Yehuda. So he says the least servant, the faithful friend, Judah, called Messer Leon. He says, he says, a Nikra Messer Leon. Bayom Mahem, and he starts talking about different things. So he gives a little bit like a very vague introduction. But another thing that, and again, this is something on Auction Chatter, but we'll say here on the full podcast, is that there is a colophone in the back of this book. Yes. So you do get kind of like some sort of actual information by Avram Konat, who we haven't talked about, the printer. Yep. And he says, Amar Avram, but this is very worth reading. This is actually a pretty fascinating one. He says, I'll read the English translation. You can read it in the Hebrew, but I'll read the English. Said Abraham, that least of the men of influence and disciple of the physicians, so he's a physician, the ordained rabbi, he says, who is the humblest of his colleagues, the son of our honored teacher, Rabbi Solomon Konat, may be remembered for life everlasting, who without working miracles, writes with many pens. So you see how they're thinking, and he says, and you can see already, they're like, wow, we are doing this with many pens. And he says, and again, it's Melitza, so he's quoting Psukim. He says, I went down into a nut garden, a shirim of perfection, and saw a volume that tells of goodly words, which as gems of sapphire are more precious than rubies, is more precious than a book of tales. And he goes to explain what Neufes Sufim is, about rhetoric and language and things like that. And he kind of explains what it is, and he gives some selections, etc. So he continues, I'm skipping. I therefore seized upon it, nay more embraced it, brought it into my chambers of imagery. He says, and he says, what does he do?
You see a lot of play on biblical words.
A lot
phrases.
Of play on words. A lot of Melitza here. That's from Michasko. Set my hand to my pens and wrote it out in order to bring many to benefit by it. May the coming of this volume into the house of him who acquires it constitute an accession of blessing, prosperity, and life for him and for his children after him, in consideration of the consequence it has in view to make Torah great and glorious. So I said this also, that you see this like he's giving a segula here. If you buy this book, you'll have it's a segula. And he continues on, and then he says, "V'yisam mishalai alav v'yomer," and he brings a parable, and he says he talks about and he ends off talking about Messer Leon. So you see where he's talking about, but how the miracle of writing with many pens, and he's like,
Constantly,
wow,
yeah.
this is 1475.
It's amazing to read the colophons because you get a sense of their wonder and awe. This particular text is really interesting for lots of reasons. Judah Messer-Leon was a very controversial person. He came to Florence preaching against learning Ralbag. Interestingly,
Mohammed Keneged Hashem, I think, is attributed to him. The famous Ralbag is a sefer from Mohammed Hashem, and there's a quote say, "Oh, Mohammed Keneged Hashem." I believe it's attributed to him.
So, but Avram Konat in Mantua also printed Ralbag. So you kind of wonder about, I'm so curious about this press for many reasons. Also, his wife, Estelina Konat, printed Bechinat Olam. She printed a book from that press, and she signs it at the end. There's a colophon, and she says, I, Estelina Konat, the wife of my husband, the great man, Avram Konat. There's a lot of really interesting books that come out of this press in particular. But I mentioned fonts earlier, and if you look at the books that are printed at this press, it's not a standard font. It's also based on handwriting, just like the square text and the what I called the semi-cursive, the Rashi print also. But this is really based on Italian handwriting. So Avram Konat is printing and he's setting types based on what he's seeing. So if you look at a Hebrew manuscript from Italy from that time, and you look at Avram Konat's printed books, it actually looks the same. It looks like it's the same handwriting. Obviously, that type it didn't work because it was only in Mantua and I think in Ferrara for a little while. And then it's never used again. There's actually a printer today that is working on, I read a few years ago, that is working on recasting this type, the Mantua type. But it's very interesting and it's different, and you get a sense of this whole period is experimental. They're trying to figure out how to utilize this new technology in the most interesting way. And so different printers are making different choices. So you see that very strongly with the Mantua Press. Choices in what they're printing, including some pretty controversial stuff, and choices in how literally the format of what they're using to print ends up being very interesting.
I'll try to put a picture of some of the stuff in the show notes. We'll link to it, or on the WhatsApp chat. You can see it really is look like handwriting, the Neufes Sufim original. It's very interesting. Another thing is there's another colophon where they say the end, and he says L'chol techila reisi kates. Each beginning is an end, and he says another mashal, and then he ends off. He says V'haisa hashlama zois harhetorika. The end of this rhetoric, Leil Dalid, the fourth night. B'dalid shoyis balayla, the fourth hour of the night. Which chodesh macheshvan, and there's chodesh macheshvan. Reish lamed hey laprat ha'elef hashishi, shehu yud beis yomim l'chodesh October. So on the 12th day of October, 1474, and he continues who it was. V'kosafti ani, I wrote it Menachem ben Rabbi Yo Mino Adumim Poi Farara Ha'ira, the Dirosi. I don't know if it's related to Azariah ben Adumim, who comes later on. And he continues on, and he ends off the colophon. So you see, they're telling you exactly when they finished the printing, when I guess the final paper came off the press, or they bound it. However, that they consider the ending of this.
You feel like they're very aware of the historicity in what they're doing. This is something big. This is something new. I need to tell you the exact hour that this happens. Also, at the Konat's press is how we learn actually how the activity of a press. There's a colophon in another one of Avram Konat's book that talks about how he printed Elef Amudim B'chol Yom Pa'amayim Ba'ava. So he says, I'm able to print 1,000 columns every day, and then Pa'amayim Ba'ava, like in Shema, I'm using that language. And from that, scholars have been able to say, well, is it 125 pages a day? Is it 250 pages a day based on the amount? Because it's two columns per page. And remember, there are 2 pages that are printed at the same time if it's a folio book. So we're thinking 4 columns, and then you divide 1,000 by 4. Or is it 2 sides of the page? There's a whole discussion in the scholarship of how many of what this means. But essentially, he's giving us information really about how the press works, just in the colophon, in how he's telling us that he finished the book. They're often very long, very flowery, poetic. They're in sometimes in shapes. They have like triangles or inverted triangles to make it also look beautiful.
Yeah, so that's the Mantua press. Now we also have Bologna, Naples. We already mentioned some in Naples. And then we can turn over to Spain and Portugal, which is so important. Italy really is going to pick up. We're going to see much more activity in Italy, especially when we get to Venice. And everyone's probably like Bamberg. Those are familiar with Bamberg.
Yeah.
Less so Ciancino. He's not people aren't as familiar with that.
No,
family
people think
anymore.
of when they hear Soncino or Soncino, they think of the
English.
20th century English
Yeah.
translations, which is actually they named themselves Soncino because they wanted to harken back to that original printer, the first known printer of the Talmud. There was printing, of course, in Spain and Portugal. We'll talk about that in a minute.
But one thing just to finish up with Mantua and the Konat, and as you say, there's really a colophon. So we're seeing information already coming out. No title page, no fancy word in like a text block with the woodcut. That's gonna come later. We don't see that yet. Let's now turn over to Spain and Portugal. This is before the expulsion. Just remember, everyone, as a refresher, the expulsion of Spain, of the Jews of Spain, is 1492, and then of Spain and Portugal, it's like the forced conversion / expulsion is 1497. However, already at this time, though, this is post 1391 world, the riots of 1391. Go listen to this Farm Chatter series in Spain, and the Jewish community is already reeling, and stuff is going on in Spain and Portugal.
As early as 1482, you see again in a colophon, they talk about it says, we finish this book, and may Hashem save us from the travails of our day. And you sort of wonder, in 1482 in Spain, what are they davening about? Like what's going on that they're nervous? And clearly it's because this is from Guadalajara. There's contemporary events happening that they're putting tefillos in the colophon as they finish the books.
Okay, so now let's talk about what do we know about the printing presses in Spain? Where were they? Spain, Portugal, what are they printing? What's going on here at these presses?
So we have a few different presses that we know about in Spain. Guadalajara, Ijar, Zamora. There are a few different places where Hebrew books are printed, and really most of what we have is in fragments. Occasionally they'll find there are a few complete volumes that have turned up, including in Spanish libraries. And then we have sort of snippets from the archives as well. The archives of the Inquisition talk about one printer who is they say that he is a Judaizer. He's acting Christian, but is Jewish because he's printing Hebrew books. That's actually his accusation, that he and his daughters are printing in Hebrew. And they cite where the servant saw the daughter bringing a Hebrew book from one place to another in the house. And that's why they're being interrogated by the Inquisition. So you have both the books themselves, which tell us about printers in Spain, and then also you actually have Inquisition documents that are telling us about other printers. We don't have any books that remain from those printers who are sentenced by the Inquisition, but maybe there were more. It's very possible. There's a whole bunch of documents from the refugees of Spain where the one person talks about how he took all of his Sfarim and he buried them under a tree. And wouldn't we all like to know which tree he buried those books under before he fled? The Abarbanel talks about how when he left Spain, he in the rush to leave and in the chaos, some of his Sfarim were lost, and then some of them he found again after his travels. Somebody took one of his Sfarim, and gave it back to him. But you see that there's very much books, like a book culture and actually printing happening in Spain. Portugal's really interesting because the first printers in Lisbon were Jews. They were printing both in Hebrew and in Roman characters. So they weren't only printing Hebrew texts, but they were Jewish. And this is documented. Those were the people who were printing because Jews are, shall we say, very into books. And so this was something that they grasped immediately, and they were immediately printing in various cities of Portugal as well.
Yeah. And so Jews are always into books. They always have been. They always will. That before this was manuscripts, and we still have many manuscripts. There were obviously many more, and manuscripts and books. Many of these books, as you said, did not survive. So we only know of what we know today, what we have, and what survives. Many don't survive. Like I said, I was with that Ramban recently from Lisbon, and it was like there's a Ramban from Portugal, 89 or whatever it is, and it's in Lakewood, New Jersey now, and it's like, how did it make it here from Portugal? Like, what tale did that have? And
it's very much books tell stories, and old books tell many stories.
The press in Spain and in Portugal come to an end because the Jewish life in Spain and Portugal come to an end. So that's really the end of them.
So it's not really the end of them because, as I said earlier, presses are mobile. All you need to do is move the type. So you have this amazing story, and I'd love to talk about my favorite. I say it's my favorite book ever printed, which is the Arba'at Turim, which is printed in Constantinople. This is the very first book ever printed in the Ottoman Empire, and it's a Jewish book. It's printed in 1493. But the typefaces match the typefaces from both Guadalajara and Ijar in Spain. There are woodcuts that are also taken from Spain. There are also fonts that come out of Naples. And there's paper that comes from Venice, and it's printed in 1493 from these two brothers whose last name who are called Ibn Nachmias. And Ibn Nachmias or Abba Nachmias is a very well-known family in Spain. And so you sort of have in one book the story of the Jews of Spain and print. Because they're fleeing Spain, they took the typefaces with them. They end up traveling across Europe, and they end up in Italy for a time. They may have actually printed in Naples. There's one, I think it's the Abarbanel actually that they're printing in Naples, and then they leave. There was actually a plague in Naples. That was the end of Hebrew printing in Naples. And they go to Constantinople, where Jews were welcomed and were allowed to practice as Jews. And so you have within the one book, you have the history of Hebrew printing, you have the history of Jews in 1492 and sort of this expulsion from Spain, and the typefaces actually move. We find them in North Africa also. Some of the typefaces from Iberian presses end up in Fez, in various places in North Africa as well, and then also in Italy. They come to Italy too.
Yeah, pretty amazing that they took the typeface with them and they were printing in the Ottoman Empire, which becomes a place of printing in Constantinople, Kushta. So we know that
very important press, Constantinople.
Yes. Although, I found that a lot of the font there, the books are not as nice as the Venice ones. The font is not as nice.
They're having a little bit of a harder time. It's not a center of printing. It's not like they have in Naples where they're able to borrow frames, for or illustrations for their books from their Christian printer friends. They're the only ones. So they have to do all the work. They can't hire a typesetter because there are no typesetters.
Do we know how they decided what they're going to print? Was it a matter of personal preference of the printer? Was it a matter of economics? Like, what's going to sell? What do people want to buy? Do they leave any of the colophones? Do they tell us anything? Or are we left to guess at what remains and what we see? And we're like, well, Rashi or Halacha or Torah or Rambam, like we see what's popular. And by the way, a lot of the things that are still popular in 2025 were popular back then. It's the same works again, Ralbag, Latero, Lesso, but it's still.
But also, it's a chicken egg question. Are they popular now because they were printed, and
Correct.
That's what remains? So we don't know what wasn't printed.
That is a very important thing. You sometimes see, you make an important point where you see things that weren't printed, and so no one knows of them, whereas they were printed. And we're going to get to Bomberg. I don't want to jump the gun for the next episode. We're going to get to what was included in the Shas and what manuscripts Bomberg used and what the press was able to acquire. And and by the way, Bomberg's not a Jew. And I don't want to leave out the whole thing. We're going to get to the Bomberg press.
Lots to say there, yeah.
But whatever they acquired, and suddenly it's like, oh, that's what's standard in Gemara, or that's what's standard in Yerushalmi, or in Rambam, or whatever it is, whatever press is doing the originals, and then it just becomes standardized, and whether that text becomes standardized, and that's what we're using, as opposed to just one example. Ibn Ezra, we know Ibn Ezra wrote two different Pirushim, long and short. We have the short Ibn Ezra on everything, that's like his later one, I think, on everything except Shmais. Shmais as the long one. But Shmais, the short one, was found and was published by Misal Shmuel Reggio in Prague in the 1800s. So now you have both on Shmais, but not everything else. But originally, they had the manuscript only of the long. So it's different, and that's how it got printed. And that's how everybody learns Ibn Ezra, because they printed it that way. So that's how it happened. But meanwhile, Ibn Ezra wrote two different ones. Which one am I supposed to read? It's sometimes you see it, just to give one example of something that's how it just came about to be. Again, that was the mazel, and that's the Siyat Shmai. That's what happened. But,
yeah, I mean, you see the books that were printed. Just looking at Rashi as an example, books of Rashi that were Sfarim Rashi that were printed in Spain actually use different manuscripts than the Sfarim Rashi that are printed in Italy, and they're different.
Yeah.
And so they haven't been, there's been like a comprehensive study of the two versions of Rashi. But obviously what ends up coming down is then what's printed in Italy, because there are very few copies that remain of the books from Spain. So what we see as Rashi comes from a number of different manuscripts which were copied and copied and copied, and maybe some mistakes came in. Maybe there were different contrasim that circulated in different ways. We just don't know. But what we have today that we say is Rashi, it became what it is today as part of a process and decisions that were made by printers. So you can add certainly Siyata Shmaya and everything else into it. But that's a really pivotal point into the text that we have today, is because of decisions made by people in a printing house.
And we're going to get to that really in episode 2. Were there any Gemaras printed in the Inca period?
Yes. So both in Spain, and actually this is a great example of what we were just talking about, both in Spain and in Italy. Tosfos are Ashkenazi Pirushim. They were learned by Ashkenazim. They were not learned by Sephardim. The Jews of Spain did not see Tosfos as the primary commentary on Gemara. Maybe they used them, but they didn't use it in the same way that they did actually use Rashi. Rashi was standard for everybody on Gemara. But if you look at the Gemaras that were printed in Spain, they don't actually have Tosfos there. And so the choice of Tosfos, and we talk about, you have Tosfos that are actually on the daf, and then you have Tosfos that are sort of the extra ones that are found, right? And so again, those are decisions that are made by the Soncino Press. The Soncino Press is printing Gemaras. They print a few. It seems that they're printing for a particular yeshiva. They're printing based on what's being, there's incredible scholarship by Yaakov Meir that is brand new, that hopefully will be published soon, about he has identified how they were learning in yeshiva based on the printing of the Soncino Talmuds. But they're looking at what the needs are for a particular audience. So they're choosing what to print, and they're going through manuscripts of the Tosfos, and the manuscripts that they happen to get are the ones that they put together into this commentary.
Yeah, this is the Maral famously said Tosfos should not be on the page. He didn't want Tosfos on the page, and he's the later part, the middle and the later part of the 16th century. These were things that weren't settled at the time. Listeners are probably familiar with the controversy around Shulchan Aruch. Should you just be opening a halacha sefer and just reading through it? And I talked about that with Professor Fram in his book. We talked about Shulchan Aruch and Marshall and others. These are things that are coming up again. This is the beginnings of everything. This is when the conversations are ongoing, and there are things that are so common to us today and so standard today. Again, Tosfos is a perfect example of what the Tosfos ended up on the page, as well as which Tosfos. And again, there's something we're going to really get into in episode 2. But which Tosfos in every Masechta has different Tosfos on each page, and like one Tosfos was put on that Masechta because that's the manuscript that the Bamberg press got, and eventually Vilna added stuff later, and Rum, the standardized version today, but things were changed, things were left out, and they didn't have that manuscript, whatever. The Mordechai, I did a podcast with Professor Canavogel. There are multiple manuscripts to Mordechai, and one ended up, there's so many different things, and what happens, and what's moving around. So these things are very interesting to see at the time. Okay, now, we've talked about various centers in Italy, as well as Spain and Portugal. Were there any Jewish books printed elsewhere in Europe? You also mentioned the Ottoman Empire, but what about Constantinople? What about in the German lands or Prague?
So the only Jewish books that are being printed in German lands, like I said at the beginning, are those that are quoting Jewish texts. They're actually mostly anti-Jewish texts. So they're quoting offensive quotes ostensibly about Christianity, but they're not being printed with movable type. They're just using woodcuts. So they're the only books that are being printed fully in Hebrew for a Jewish audience are Spain, Portugal, Italy, Constantinople.
So I guess one of the things that we should end with is, do we know, we talked about this, but I don't know if we'd focused, how many copies of these books were printed? First of all, we have a handful of some of these today left, but how many were printed on a standard run?
So we think based on this colophon by Avram Konat, that it probably comes out to about 250 or 300 books in a standard run at this period. There are other studies that have other numbers, but this is the one that we have for Hebrew books in particular. So that gives us about 300 books at a time. And again, you're thinking about like the richest people are buying this, or only, but still they're all buying copies of the exact same book. So that's about what we have is 300.
And how were these books sold? There was booksellers. Were people signing up? You have the prenumerated. Were they signing up?
So I don't think we don't have prenumerated until much later. But we do have. There's a manuscript at the Library of Congress. Not a manuscript. There's an incunable at the Library of Congress that includes the deed of sale. I think it's a Soncino book where he himself sold it. He writes, I sell this book to this person for this amount of money. So we have some examples. There are a couple of at the National Library of Israel as well. There's some good work that Alexander Gordon has done on this when he looked at the National Library of Israel's books, where it says, I am the printer and I'm selling this book to somebody wrote it in by hand. I'm selling this book to the buyer. So it was sold directly from the printer to the buyer. There's no such thing as a bookshop, for instance, at this point.
Right. Another thing is that there are no title pages, really, no fancy, again with the woodcut around the first word of the text, and there are no haskamas.
No. We do have fancy woodcuts. We just don't have title pages, but we do
but that
have.
We do have.
Yeah,
okay.
And in some cases it's interesting because it's this moment between manuscript and print. So there are some books that actually have just a big blank space at the beginning where you're supposed to have a scribe write in the initial word, that first word, in a beautiful way. You may have seen like Bereshis written beautifully in manuscript.
Correct.
So there are actually some in Canabula. There's one that I'm thinking I think it's at the British Library, where you see they actually brought it to a scribe who decorated the whole thing, and they wrote the first word, I think, Bereshis, in the top of it. We have an example of a Yosipon where it clearly was meant to be written in the first word at the very top, but it's not there. The owner decided not to do it. And actually, you see much more that there's sort of this manuscript decoration in Christian books than in Hebrew books. In the Jewish books, it was done much less. But then you have that, especially Soncino is a good example, where he has these decorated initial letters. So he'll put together, if you've ever seen like the Me'ei Masai of the very first printed brachos, it's written in these like stylized letters, and he would put those at the top of the page.
Yeah, and we're going to get to him and who that family was and who the main, that's all going to be the next episode. And Haskamas also aren't a thing now, which Haskamas end up being copyright is what they really were at the beginning. I talked about that way back when, and from Maimonides to Microsoft with Professor Nina Tanel. That was an old
wonderful
thing. So that's,
book.
a wonderful book. That's a different thing. So there were no Haskamas now. These are just, so this is the really early prints we're talking about, incunables. That's what this episode, really the first century of print, and they're very interesting. And this is, again, how it impacts us. And I think it's still impactful today. I mean, Bomberg and more so in some ways, and we're going to get there. That'll be in episode 2. So that is really episode 1. I do want to end off. Is there any suggested reading? I mentioned Amram, Hebrew Books in Italy by David Amram. Again, the makers of Hebrew Books in Italy by David Amram. It is outdated, but it's still a wonderful read, especially to start off. I find that if you start with like old scholarship, you could read it, just get a feel, get a sense of like things are sometimes as good. There's a very good book on books in general called The Book. It's not
a fun
about
read, but
Jewish books by Keith Houston, published by W.W. Norton. It's just, it literally, as it says, a cover-to-cover exploration of the most powerful object of our time. That's something that if someone wants to find out more about.
It actually
books.
talks about Torah scrolls. It talks about Jewish scrolls, the Jewish use of scrolls. It's interesting.
So that's interesting. And there's many other things to read. Are there anything in particular you would mention to the listeners?
Yeah. So for an overview of Hebrew print, unfortunately, there's not really a good contemporary overview. There are a few things that you could use just to get a sense of things. Sometimes they get a little technical. The Hebrew book is a wonderful selection of essays, and there's an essay on early print by Israel Tashma. But that's 50 years old. That's from 1974.
And it's not around, I don't think, either.
It's hard to get. There was also an exhibit in New York that's called something like 2,000 Years of the Jewish Book. It's based on an exhibition that was at the New York Public Library of multiple with materials from multiple collections, and that also has a lovely essay by I think it's Mordechai Glatzer, if I'm not mistaken. And then there's, but for a good overview, it's actually really hard. There are a lot of articles. There are a lot of book chapters that go into like the specifics of things. But the Encyclopedia of Jewish Book Cultures, which unfortunately is only a database at this point and is mostly accessible through universities, is probably the best and most current way to access things, but that's not accessible to the Hamon Am. So if somebody wanted to, maybe somebody will sponsor a book, on the history of the Jewish book for a general audience. That's really a need in the field, I would say.
Yeah. Absolutely, because this is something that's important. And so hopefully the listeners, this episode wasn't too technical, as we're going to get more into Shansino and Bamberg and the workings of the Bamberg Press, which is fascinating, as well as Shansino as well, and in Venice. And those are really foundational texts, Mekres Gedolos, Talmud Bavli, Talmud Yerushalmi, Rambam. These are things that really foundational for us today still. So thank you, Michelle, for joining me on this first episode. And thanks, Sefaria, again, for sponsoring this episode and this mini-series. And for those that, again, we said the whole ad read in the beginning, but I think everybody's probably familiar with Sefaria. So you should go check out, download the app, check out Sefaria if you don't have it. You should definitely check it out. I will link, of course, to Sefaria in the show notes. But again, you can just Google Sefaria. You can take their, you get to download it for offline reading or whatever you have the...
and you can think about new technologies and the Jewish book.
Correct.
When you look at Sefaria. We'll talk about that.
Correct. Yeah, that's going to be coming. We're going to talk about that at the end of the series. So thank you. Hope everyone enjoyed this episode and stay tuned for episode 2.